And our top story this hour, the Kremlin says it is not possible to completely isolate Russia as the West continues piling up sanctions on Moscow over its military operation in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says, quote, "It is technologically impossible in the modern world to fully isolate Russia." He says the world is much larger than Europe, adding sooner or later, quote, "We will have to build a dialogue whether some overseas want it or not." Western capitals have slapped unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia since it moved the troops into Ukraine on February 24th. There are also travel bans and asset freezes on a number of government figures, including President Vladimir Putin. Tony Gosling is a historian and investigative journalist and joins us now from the British city of Bristol. Tony, welcome. It's good to see you.
Hi.
Now, good, yeah. So we've got Tony. Tony, can you isolate a country as large as Russia?
No, actually, it's totally impossible to do that, and I don't think it's at all possible. No. The idea really here is that the United States seems to think that there is no other way of, I mean, like for example, that countries like India, Pakistan, etc., are not there. So no, it isn't possible to isolate Russia at all.
Is it the aim, perhaps, Tony, of some countries to isolate Russia and maybe prolong the conflict in Ukraine by freezing more and more Russian assets?
Well, of course, but you see, the thing is that they can't really do anything militarily from NATO and the West, and so what they're having to do now is simply to pretend they can to their own domestic population and to themselves. I think it's one of those expressions from Dostoevsky, actually, the great Russian writer, that maybe they have just simply not read him. Is that in some circumstances you may have to lie to get your way. Now, I mean, I don't think that's the right thing to do, but I'm afraid we see quite a lot of that in the diplomatic world from all sides, really. But the worst thing you can do is, and you should never lie to yourself. And I think that's what's going on. We've got the leaders in the West are lying to themselves and to each other that they can actually discipline Russia and discipline Putin simply by sanctions. And of course, this is never going to work, and it can't work because over many years now, the Russians and other countries that have been sanctioned have actually, in some ways, grown more independent and stronger through those sanctions. And I'm afraid it's indicative of the total lack of reality at the top. Of course, this is something which we who live in Western countries are very well aware of. We've seen complete mismanagement of our economies and the collapse, say, for example, here in Britain, of industries which were just simply allowed to be sold abroad. And we've got a population now which is at the highest poverty level since the end of the Second World War, because there's simply not the jobs for people to do, and we've got millions now who are even in work on government benefits because the economy has been so badly managed, and so I'm afraid most of this is caused by a complete failure and lack of leadership in the West, and also, as I said, a lack of reality. Is they're lying to themselves by thinking that sanctions will really make a difference to in international diplomacy. This is the sort of thing that countries would only do if they have failed to come up with a strategy. It really is an admission that they have no proper strategy at all.
It really is mind-boggling, Tony, because the more and more sanctions that they impose on countries, independent countries, those countries are declaring that their goal is to now trade in their own currencies, which is going to backfire on the US dollar. How much of an effect do you think that's going to have on the American currency? You've got news now, reports of even Saudi Arabia in advanced talks with China about selling oil to China, not in petrodollars, but in the Chinese currency.
Well, one of my favourite economists, and I don't say favourite in any other way other than I think he's independent-minded and very articulate, Michael Hudson, has put it very succinctly. This is the end of the dollar. as the reserve currency of the world, because many countries are now saying, well, we're going to actually not be using the I mean, actually, it was President Nixon back in the 1970s that took the dollar off the gold standard, and since then it's been living on petrodollars on borrowed time. But the dollar is going. I think what we're looking at, and I was reading a book called The Pandemic of Fear recently, which is excellent. It's actually by a Dutch author, Kees van der Peel, and his analysis, I think, is excellent. It's absolutely spot on. What's happened is, as these elites and cartels in the West begin to take over, basically take over their economies. So, in other words, you've got rackets through oil cartels, various other industrial cartels, steel cartels, so that the capitalist system breaks down. We've seen it in the arms industry, in arms cartels. So these markets are divided up amongst the various players who are colluding against the public. And as that begins to happen, they know that millions, if not billions of people are going to be annoyed. They are what they call restive. In other words, you're going to have a population that you need to control. And so various measures, including some of the more extreme COVID measures, now, of course, including the possibility of wartime measures, wartime austerity. We're now talking about the potential of rationing here in Britain, one of the richest, I think it's the 6th richest economy in the world. And that's what Kees is writing about, really. He's saying that these are actually elite strategies to deal with the restive masses, the large proportion of the population out there who are just totally unsatisfied by what is an increasingly authoritarian and what Putin himself called a decorative democracy. Right. That is to say that you've got all of the facets of a democratic show going on, but no real democracy at all, where all the candidates are basically working for the same industrial cartels.
Just finally, Tony, like 30 seconds we've got left. When Peskov says it is technologically impossible in the modern world to fully isolate Russia, what do you think he means by that?
Well, he's saying that however much the US switches off what it believes are the main routes for trade, whether that be physically, saying you cannot bring ships through here, whether it means sanctions, whether it means, for example, cutting off Russia from the US and European controlled financial exchange systems like the SWIFT system, etc., that actually the trading is going to carry on. It's just going to be done on different systems. So what's happening is, as Hudson was saying about the end of the dollar, is those systems will switch. It'll go over to more of a Chinese system, a Russian system, a South African system, a Brazilian system, the BRICS countries, and of course there are many other systems out there which will do this. What the Americans are doing and what the British are doing is really shooting themselves in the foot. But then they don't really care about that, I don't think, because they don't care about their own populations very much. And if their own populations suffer, well, that could be a good thing, couldn't it? Because those populations are potentially going to get agitated and vote them out of office. So if the population is on the back foot domestically here in the United States and Europe, then the elite over here see that as a good thing, so long as there's not an election looming in the UK or a credible opposition, which there isn't at the moment in the House of Commons, this for them is an advantage because they want to see their populations basically thrust into poverty, thrust into insecurity, and then they can control them more easily. So they see it as a win-win situation. But I'm afraid, quite definitely this means it is likely to be a more confrontation with the Russians. In other words, it's going to be hotter and hotter in Eastern Europe, and also, of course, they're basically kicking the can down the road. And I think we can expect to see all sorts of protests, people out on the streets over in the West complaining about their own government's mismanagement of their economy.